70 Apache warriors came to his door, each holding a single white feather, their eyes fixed on one unarmed cowboy who had no horse, no weapon, and no escape. What he didn't know was that yesterday's single act of kindness had already sealed his fate. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon, washing the desert in a pale, golden light. Dust hung still in the air, stirred only by the stamping hooves of the horses lined across his yard like a living wall. Their riders sat motionless, statues carved in flesh and bone, each feather glinting white against the vast red sky of Arizona Territory, 1881. Inside the cabin, Elias Harper's throat tightened. The boards of the floor creaked beneath his boots as he stepped closer to the doorway. His ranch, what little was left of it after years of drought and debt, stood silent, lifeless. No cattle, no horses, nothing but this weather-beaten shack on land that once promised hope. Now hope had vanished, replaced by 70 pairs of dark, unblinking eyes. Elias felt for the familiar weight of a holster at his side, only to touch empty leather. He hadn't carried a pistol in weeks. He had pawned it for supplies during the last dry spell. All that remained was a silver bridle hanging by the door, his father's bridle, the only heirloom left from a family buried by fever and time. He glanced at it now, and a memory cut through the silence, his mother's voice reading by lamplight when he was a boy. "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Luke 6:31. That verse had seemed so simple then, a child's lesson. Yesterday, it had felt like a command. Because yesterday, Elias had stumbled across a woman half collapsed by a dry creek bed, her dark hair matted with sweat, her leg bound in a blood-soaked strip of cloth. Apache, he had realized instantly. Every instinct told him to walk away. Apache country was death for trespassers, and helping one of their women could be seen as insult or worse. But her eyes had stopped him cold. Not pleading, not even afraid. Just a resigned dignity, the kind he had seen once before, in his sister's face, in her last hours when fever took her beyond his reach. So he had done the unthinkable. He had lifted the woman onto his only horse, the last possession of any worth, and led the animal for miles through rock and sand until Apache dwellings appeared in the distance. He had given the reins a final slap, sending the horse trotting after her, and stood there empty-handed, watching both his future and his survival disappear into the canyons. Now, less than a day later, the consequence of that choice filled his yard. 70 warriors, silent as death, holding feathers instead of rifles or bows. Why feathers? Why silence? And why, in all his years on the frontier, did this feel more dangerous than any battle he had ever imagined? Elias Harper stepped out onto the porch, boots grinding against the dust. The silence was unbearable. No whispers, no shifting saddles, not even the call of a desert bird. Only the faint groan of the wind against the cliffs beyond his land. The Apache riders did not move. Their feathers caught the morning light, white against sun-browned skin and leather. Elias had heard stories of war paint, of weapons carried into raids, but never of feathers like these. What did they mean? He tried to swallow, but his throat was dry. His canteen had been near empty when he stumbled home the night before, after walking half the night without horse or water. His legs still ached from the miles, but the greater weight was the knowledge that he had broken every frontier law of self-preservation. A man didn't give away his horse, not if he wanted to live. Yet he had, and because of that, 70 men now stared at him as though waiting for a sign. His thoughts dragged back to the woman, Ayana, she had whispered, before slipping into fevered sleep on the trail. He remembered steadying her limp body in the saddle, listening to her murmur words he couldn't understand. For 6 hours he had walked beside her, leading the horse as the sun burned above and shadows stretched long across the canyon. He had known exactly what he was risking. When they reached the border of Apache territory, marked by 3 red stones stacked like a warning, he had let her slide from the saddle. Ahead lay the outlines of dwellings, smoke rising faintly. He could have taken the reins, mounted, and fled back into the night. But he hadn't. Instead, with a strange impulse he couldn't explain, he slapped the horse's flank, sending it after her. The animal obeyed like it had always belonged to her. Elias had stood in the dust, empty hands hanging at his sides, as Ayanna stumbled forward toward her people. It was only then, watching his last possession vanish into enemy land, that he realized what he had done. And now those people had come to him. From the line of mounted warriors, one man finally moved. He was older than the rest, streaks of gray running through his black hair, his presence commanding. Slowly, he raised his hand, and the formation shifted as one, the riders adjusting their horses with perfect discipline. Elias's pulse quickened. This was no raid, no chaos. It was deliberate, calculated, as though every rider played a part in a ceremony whose rules he did not know. The elder warrior began to descend the ridge toward the cabin. The others remained still, their feathers glinting like silent judgment. Every instinct told Elias to run, but where? The desert stretched endless in every direction, and without horse or rifle he wouldn't last a day. He gripped the doorframe to steady himself, eyes fixed on the man approaching. That was when he noticed the necklace, bones strung carefully, worn with age. And at the warrior's belt hung something that froze Elias's blood cold. A scalp, brown hair, the exact color of his own. Yet the warrior's eyes did not burn with anger. They held something stranger. Expectation. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The old warrior reached the foot of the porch and stopped 10 paces away. Dust clung to his buckskin leggings, and a necklace of small bones rattled faintly in the morning breeze. In his right hand he held a white feather, identical to those of the others. But in his left he carried something that struck Elias like a hammer to the chest. The silver bridle that had once belonged to his father. It was his bridle, but not as he remembered it. Painted symbols now ran across the leather, red and black lines curling in patterns he didn't understand. They shimmered faintly with dusted pigment, as though the marks had been applied only hours ago. The warrior lifted the bridle high, then pointed to Elias's chest. When he spoke, the word carried the weight of ritual, though Elias understood none of it. Behind him, the other riders remained still, watching like silent judges. Their feathers did not move, but their gaze pressed against Elias, as though they expected him to answer for something he could not name. Elias stepped off the porch, boots sinking into dry sand. "That's mine," he said quietly, his voice rasped from thirst. "Where did you get it?" The warrior tilted his head, eyes calm but unreadable. He repeated the Apache word and tapped the bridle again. Then, slowly, he extended it outward, as though presenting it not back to Elias, but as evidence. From the ridge, movement stirred. A group descended, women in long dresses, children clinging to their mothers' sides, and among them, limping heavily, was Ayanna. She leaned on the arm of an elder whose headdress bore a crown of feathers more elaborate than any Elias had seen. The procession approached with measured steps, every face solemn, every gaze fixed on the cowboy who had brought their wounded daughter home. Elias's stomach nodded. He had expected anger, arrows, perhaps a quick death. Instead, what came felt worse. Ceremony. Deliberate, inescapable. Ayanna's eyes found his. Gratitude flickered there, but also something that chilled him, pity. The elder with the feathered crown stepped forward. His presence silenced even the restless stamping of horses. He spoke in a voice like stone cracking in fire, and Ayanna, though weak, translated softly. "My grandfather says you gave your horse to save his granddaughter. Among our people, this is no small act. The horse is not just a beast. It is the breath of a warrior. To give it away is to give away part of your soul." Elias swallowed, the bridle's painted symbols burning into his mind. Ayana's voice wavered but continued. "He says you have invoked the law of the horse gift. This law is older than the white man's government, older than the cavalry. It binds the giver to the life he has saved and to her people. You are now tied to us." The elder fixed Elias with eyes that held no hatred, only certainty. He raised his hand, and 70 feathers lifted skyward in unison. The message was clear. Yesterday, Elias had thought he was saving a woman's life. Today, he realized he had signed a covenant written in blood, honor, and law he did not understand. They took him from his porch without a word of threat. No hands bound him, no weapons pressed against his back, yet Elias felt as captive as any man led in chains. The procession of warriors rode ahead and behind, silent guardians of a law he had only just learned existed. The land shifted as they traveled. What Elias thought he knew of the canyons, dry, barren, lifeless, proved false. The trail wound downward into a basin hidden from the world. Towering walls of red stone rose on all sides, sheltering a village that seemed to grow out of the earth itself. Round dwellings of brush and clay stood in precise patterns, smoke curling from their tops. Children paused from their play to stare at him with wide, curious eyes. Women grinding maize at stone slabs lifted their heads and nodded with quiet respect. Even the dogs seemed subdued, as though they understood this day carried weight. Elias's chest tightened. He had walked past Apache villages before, always from a distance, always expecting an arrow in the back if he strayed too close. Now he was in the very heart of one. Yet instead of hostility, he found something stranger, watchfulness. Every glance measured him, weighed him, as if the people were deciding what kind of man he was before the ceremony confirmed it. He thought of the stories told in border towns, tales of raids, ambushes, and endless violence. Those stories had painted the Apache as shadows, savages without mercy. But here, in the quiet order of this basin, Elias sensed something different: discipline, structure, honor. He remembered his father once saying, "Son, don't ever mistake fierceness for lawlessness. Even warriors have codes you may not understand." The elder with the feathered headdress spoke again. His words carried through Ayana's tired but steady voice. "You wonder why no blades cut your flesh. You are not yet an enemy. You are not yet a brother. You stand between worlds, and until the choosing is done, you are sacred." Sacred? The word lodged in Elias's mind like a burr. Sacred? Him? They guided him to the center of the village, where a large fire pit lay waiting, ringed by carefully placed stones. Already men were bringing wood, stacking it with practiced rhythm. Women prepared herbs and clay pots of paint. The air smelled of sage and smoke, sharp and cleansing. Elias's throat ached with thirst, but more than that with bewilderment. How had he come here? A failed rancher, a man who had lost family, fortune, and faith, now standing in the center of a people who spoke of him as though his actions carried divine weight. He closed his eyes for a moment, hearing again the words his mother had once read in the flickering light of their small ranch home. "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." Matthew 25:35. Yesterday, he had thought himself a fool for giving away the only thing that kept him alive. Now, looking at the faces of children and elders alike, he wondered if perhaps God had led him into this valley, not for survival, but for judgment. The sun inched lower in the sky, shadows stretched long. Somewhere in the hush of the village, a drum began to beat slowly, each note like the toll of a bell. The choosing ceremony was drawing near. By late afternoon, the village had gathered. The air shimmered with heat rising from the fire pit as flames licked upward, fed by cedar and mesquite. Smoke curled into the fading sky, carrying with it the tang of sage and something Elias could not name. They placed him at the center of a wide stone circle. His wrists were bound behind him with rope braided from plant fibers, coarse against his skin, yet strong as leather. He tested it once, half-heartedly, but knew resistance was pointless. The circle itself felt like a cage, not of wood or iron, but of eyes. Dozens, then hundreds, ringed him. Men, women, children, every face solemn, every breath held as if this night belonged to eternity. 5 elders entered and seated themselves opposite him. Ayana's grandfather sat at the center, his headdress of feathers trailing down his shoulders like a mantle of authority. Beside him sat 2 men and 2 women, their faces lined by decades of desert wind and hard choices. They bore the calm of judges who had weighed life and death many times before. Ayana stood slightly behind her grandfather, ready to translate. But Elias suspected that more than one elder already understood his language. Their sharp eyes searched his face with unnerving clarity, as though they could read the truth in his silence before he spoke a word.
The questioning began. "Why were you in our land?" the elder asked through Ayana's soft voice. Elias swallowed. "I was looking for new grazing ground. My ranch is gone. The drought took what little I had." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Another elder leaned forward, her dark eyes piercing. She spoke briefly, and Ayana hesitated before translating. "Why did you help, Ayana? Did you expect reward from our people?" "No," Elias shook his head, the ropes tightening against his wrists. "I expected nothing. Truthfully, I thought I might not live through it. But leaving her there, wounded and alone, felt worse than dying." The third elder's voice cut sharper, like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. "Do you believe yourself a good man, a hero?" The question struck deeper than any arrow. Elias drew in a ragged breath. He wanted to say yes, to claim some scrap of dignity, but the words refused to come. His chest ached with memories, his sister's face in her final hours, the graves he had left behind when fever swept his family, the ranch falling into dust under his care. "I don't know if I'm good," he admitted finally. His voice cracked like dry wood.
"I just know that walking away would have been wrong. That's all I knew." A long silence followed. Then the 4th elder spoke, his tone grave. Ayana's lips trembled as she translated. "He asks why you did not take her to your own people. You could have brought her to white doctors. Why give her back to us?" Elias's throat burned. He lowered his gaze to the dust beneath him. "Because she belongs with her own. Taking her away, even to save her life, would have been another kind of cruelty." The elders conferred in hushed voices. Finally, Ayana's grandfather rose, his hand lifted to quiet the murmuring crowd. His voice carried across the circle, deep and solemn. Ayana's eyes filled as she translated. "They say your heart spoke truth today. You helped not for gain, not for pride, but because you could not do otherwise. You have passed the first test." Relief flooded Elias's chest, but it was thin and fleeting, for he saw in the elder's eyes that the true trial had only just begun. The elder's decision rippled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Faces softened, shoulders eased, though no one smiled. Passing the first test did not grant freedom. It only cleared the path to something greater and perhaps far more dangerous. Ayana's grandfather motioned to the fire. Flames leapt higher as men added fresh cedar branches, sparks swirling into the dimming sky. The setting sun painted the canyon walls in blood-red streaks. Shadows stretched across the circle, long and thin, like fingers closing around Elias. The elder dipped his hand into a clay plot of dark pigment and drew a symbol on his own forehead, a sharp line that curved downward into a circle. He spoke a single phrase, and a young warrior stepped forward, carrying the same pot. The thick, earthy smell of the paint filled Elias's nostrils as it was held out to him. Ayana translated softly, her voice carrying both reverence and warning. "My grandfather says you must mark yourself as one who accepts the path. Without the mark, the ceremony cannot continue. The clay pot trembled in Elias's hands. He dipped his finger, smearing the cool, gritty paint across his brow, copying the elder's design as best he could. The moment the mark was drawn, a low chant began. It started with the 5 elders, voices deep and steady.
Then others joined, women, men, children, until the circle hummed with layered tones that rose and fell like the desert wind. The sound filled the basin, not fierce like a war cry, but solemn like prayer. For a heartbeat, Elias was transported back to another time. His mother's voice echoed in memory, ashes pressed to his forehead in a small adobe church long ago. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. The ritual here was different, older, but the weight was the same. A reminder of mortality, of frailty, of standing before judgment greater than man. The chanting deepened. Warriors beat slow rhythms on rawhide drums. Women shook rattles filled with pebbles, the sound sharp against the fire's crackle. Smoke from burning sage rose in thick waves, stinging Elias's eyes and carrying a scent both cleansing and suffocating. One by one, elders stepped forward to question him again, not with words this time, but with silence. They circled him, studying the mark on his forehead, his bound hands, the lines of his face etched by sun and sorrow. Their gazes probed deeper than their questions had, as if searching for weakness in his very soul. Ayanna leaned closer, her voice low so only he could hear. They watch to see if fear breaks you now. The paint is not only for the ceremony, it is a mirror. How you bear it shows what is inside you. Elias kept his chin lifted, though sweat trickled down his neck and the rope dug into his wrists. His heart pounded against his ribs, but he forced himself to breathe with the rhythm of the drums. Each beat steadied him, like footsteps carrying him toward a place he had never chosen but could not turn from. At last the elder raised both arms. The chanting ceased in unison, leaving only the pop of flames. He spoke in solemn tones, Ayanna translating once more. You have taken the mark. You have shown that your heart is steady. But this is only the beginning. The next test will demand more than truth. It will demand sacrifice. The words settled heavy as stone. Around the circle, torches were lit, their flames dancing in the rising night. Shadows thickened, and Elias felt the world close in. The first test had been about honesty. The second would be about survival. 2 young men entered the circle, carrying a long wooden box. They set it carefully at the feet of Ayanna's grandfather and stepped back. The elder bent down, his movements deliberate, and lifted the lid. Inside lay 5 arrows, each bound with colored bands, red, black, white, yellow, and blue. The crowd fell silent. Even the drums stilled, as if the entire village held its breath. Ayanna's grandfather lifted the first arrow, the red one, and spoke. Ayanna translated, her voice hushed. The red arrow means the rapids of Devil's Canyon. Whoever draws it must cross the waters at night, when the rocks are sharp and the current devours the careless. He replaced the red arrow and drew the black. The black arrow means the mountain cat's cave. One must enter and bring back a stone from its deepest chamber. The white arrow gleamed in the firelight. The white arrow means the cliff that no one has climbed in living memory. To attempt it is to risk death on the rocks below. The yellow arrow came next. The yellow arrow sends one alone into the lands of our rivals, those who killed 3 of our people last spring. They must return with proof of peace or not return at all. Finally, the elder held the blue arrow, his hand lingering on it longer than the others. His voice grew lower, heavier. The blue arrow means rattlesnake venom. One must allow the serpent to strike and trust our medicine to heal or to fail. He placed the arrows back in the box. 5 volunteers stepped forward from the circle, each carrying the quiet dignity of those prepared to die. Elias's breath caught as his eyes scanned their faces. A boy no older than 16, his jaw set, though fear flickered in his eyes. A woman with kind features, perhaps 40, her gaze calm and maternal. An older warrior scarred from past battles, standing tall and resolute. A teenage girl, her hair tied with a simple cord. Something about her eyes pierced Elias's heart with memory of his own sister lost to fever years before. And finally, a man near Elias's own age, whose wife and small children clung to him from the crowd, their eyes glistening with unshed tears. The elder spoke again. Ayanna's voice trembled as she gave the translation. One of them must take an arrow. You must choose who suffers in your place. Elias's stomach turned. The weight of the ropes around his wrists felt lighter than the burden of the choice before him. He stared at the five, at the silent courage in their eyes, and shook his head. "This isn't sacrifice," he rasped. "It's cruelty. How can I choose one life to risk so I may live?" Ayanna's gaze lowered. That is the test. Many choose quickly, believing another's pain is fair payment. But there is another path. The arrows can all belong to you. Her voice nearly broke as she whispered the final words. If you take them all, you walk into certain death. The crowd murmured. Torches flared as wind passed through the canyon, shadows leaping against stone walls. Elias closed his eyes. He could almost hear his sister's voice, faint as memory. Real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing right when fear consumes you. When he opened his eyes again, the 5 volunteers were watching him, not with expectation, but with quiet hope. He drew a long breath, his voice steady. "Then I'll take them all, every trial. No one else will suffer for me." The gasp that rose from the crowd was like thunder, and in the torchlight, 70 feathers lifted skyward in unison. The murmurs swelled into a rising wave of disbelief. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others turned to one another, whispering words Elias could not understand. But above all, there was silence from the 5 volunteers. One by one, relief softened their faces. The boy's shoulders eased. The woman's eyes glistened. The scarred warrior bowed his head in respect. The teenage girl looked at Elias as though seeing her brother returned from the grave. And the father wrapped an arm around his wife and children, holding them close. The elder with the feathered crown studied Elias with an expression that revealed nothing at first. But then his eyes deepened, carrying a flicker of something rare, admiration. He spoke slowly, his words deliberate. Ayanna's voice shook as she translated. "My grandfather says no man has ever offered this before. To take all 5 arrows alone is certain death. Yet in this you have shown your heart already." The old man gestured to the warriors surrounding the circle. At once, 70 riders raised their white feathers high, the sound of leather creaking as arms moved in unison. The feathers caught the firelight, glowing pale against the darkness. The gesture carried no hostility, only solemnity, like a salute reserved for the rarest of warriors. Elias felt the weight of that salute press against him. His mouth was dry, his heart pounding, yet strangely he felt steadier than he had all day. The fear had not vanished, but it no longer ruled him. In its place stood resolve. The elder stepped closer, his feathered mantle brushing the air. He spoke again, and Ayanna's lips trembled with the weight of his words. "He says the trials are no longer needed. You have already passed the test of sacrifice. What matters is not the wounds of the flesh, but the choice of the heart. A man who would rather die than condemn another is already bound to us by the oldest law." Gasps broke from the crowd. Children clutched their mothers. The 5 volunteers fell to their knees, lowering their heads in reverence. Even the drums stilled, leaving only the crackle of the great fire. Elias blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Passed?" His voice was barely more than a whisper. Ayanna nodded, tears streaking her dust-stained cheeks.
Yes, you have shown more than courage.
You have shown the heart of a brother." The elder raised his hands skyward, speaking in solemn tones. This time, Ayana did not translate immediately. Her face was turned upward, lips moving silently as if caught in prayer. Finally, she looked back at Elias, her voice thick with emotion. "He says tonight you will not be tested by fire, water, stone, or venom. You will be tested by honor, and by honor you have already prevailed." The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in a low chant, voices weaving together in a rhythm that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The sound was both haunting and uplifting, a hymn of recognition. For the first time since this ordeal began, Elias allowed himself a long breath. He had offered his life, and instead of death, he was met with something he had never expected: acceptance. Yet deep inside, a quiet unease lingered. He knew the night was not finished. The tribe had accepted his heart, but what would come next? The flames roared higher, and the chants swelled into the canyon walls. Elias Harper stood in the circle of fire and feathers, no longer a stranger, but not yet certain what tomorrow would bring.
If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The fire roared higher as the elder rose to his feet. His feathered mantle shimmered in the torchlight, each plume trembling like the breath of the canyon itself. He lifted his hands, and silence fell over the gathered tribe. The drums stopped. Even the children stilled, as though the earth itself was listening. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of generations. Ayana's translation came softly, but with a tremor that betrayed her awe. "My grandfather says no man has ever chosen what you have chosen. To take all trials upon yourself is to embrace certain death. Yet by offering it freely, you have already proven the truth of your heart. The law does not demand your flesh when your spirit has already given everything." A hush swept the circle, then a movement Elias could scarcely comprehend. One by one, the 70 mounted warriors dismounted in perfect unison, their moccasins landing softly on the dust. They stepped forward, each man carrying his white feather. The first warrior, the gray-haired man who had led them, knelt before Elias. He pressed his feather into the dirt at Elias's feet. Another followed, then another. Soon a carpet of pale plumes formed around him, a sea of white glowing against the black soil. Elias's chest tightened. He had stood against armed men before, had faced debt collectors, drought, and death itself. But nothing had ever undone him like this quiet act of reverence. The elder's voice rang out again, Ayana's words following like a shadow. "They kneel not because you are stronger, but because you are willing to give your life. In our law, such willingness is greater than any victory in battle." Elias's throat burned. He wanted to speak, to deny the honor, to confess that he had acted without wisdom, only desperation and memory of a sister he had once failed. But the words died. Here, silence seemed the only answer worthy of the moment. The feathers continued to pile. Warriors with faces stern as stone laid down their symbols of honor. Some placed small trinkets as well, a bead, a carved bone, a scrap of dyed cloth, tokens that seemed insignificant, yet radiated meaning in the fire's glow. Elias lowered his eyes, not from shame, but from the weight of it. He felt smaller than he had ever felt, and yet at the same time more seen than in all his years wandering the frontier. Ayana's voice broke into his thoughts. "My grandfather says this is the point of no return. You are no longer stranger. You are not yet fully brother. But after tonight, you cannot walk as you once did. The feathers bind you. They carry the weight of 70 families and the eyes of their ancestors." The flames cracked, sparks drifting upward like spirits into the night sky. Elias stared at the white feathers at his feet, and for the first time he understood the truth.
Yesterday he had thought himself a fool for giving away a horse. Today he realized he had given away his old life. There would be no turning back. The fire's glow spread across the circle as the warrior stepped back, leaving behind the sea of feathers. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a woman from the crowd stepped forward, carrying a folded blanket woven in crimson and gold. She laid it carefully beside the feathers at Elias's feet. Another followed, setting down a knife with a handle carved from bone and inlaid with turquoise. A third brought a necklace strung with polished stones.
Soon the circle stirred with movement as men, women, and even children came forth, each bearing a gift. Some were simple, dried meat wrapped in cloth, a clay pot of water. Others shone with hours of labor. Baskets dyed with intricate patterns, jewelry hammered from silver, embroidered garments stitched with steady hands. The pile grew higher. The colors of the desert gathered into a mound of gratitude. Elias could only watch, his throat tight, as strangers he had once feared laid down the work of their hands before him. These were not tokens offered lightly. Each gift carried weight. Food meant survival. Blankets meant warmth. Knives meant protection. They were giving of themselves, of their families, of their lives. He thought of the emptiness of his own cabin, the bare shelves, the pawned rifle, the land parched and lifeless. He had left with nothing but a bridle and his memories. Now, without lifting a hand, more wealth and honor gathered before him than he had ever known. Ayanna leaned close, her voice low. Among my people, a gift is never only a gift. Each one binds giver and receiver together. They are showing you that your fate is theirs now.
They will not let you walk alone. The weight of her words pressed deeper than any rope. Elias looked at the mound and felt as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted. Then the crowd parted and a murmur swept through like wind across dry grass. Two warriors approached, leading a horse between them. Elias's breath caught. It was his horse. The animal stepped into the firelight, its familiar gait steady, its coat brushed to a shine. But it no longer wore the plain tack Elias had known. The bridle was adorned with painted designs, symbols etched in red and black. Feathers hung from its mane, swaying gently in the breeze. Across its chest, a breastplate of beadwork glimmered, patterns telling stories Elias could not read. The elder gestured toward the horse, his voice solemn. Ayanna translated, though her own eyes shone with tears. Your horse has been returned, not as it was, but as it is now, an honored steed of our people. To ride it is to carry our respect. Its markings will protect you in any Apache land. Elias stepped forward, his knees weak. He reached for the reins, the leather warm against his calloused hands. For a moment, he could not breathe.
He had given this animal away in desperation, expecting never to see it again. Now it returned not as loss, but as gift. He looked into the horse's dark eyes and saw reflected there the truth. He had surrendered everything, and in that surrender had gained more than he could have imagined. The pile of offerings gleamed in the firelight, a mountain of color and texture. The horse stood quietly at Elias's side, its breath steady, its reins still in his grasp. The chanting had ceased, and in the silence that followed, the elder moved forward. He stopped directly before Elias. For a moment, the two men, one aged by decades of war and wisdom, the other worn by drought, grief, and loneliness, simply regarded one another. Then the elder raised his hand and placed it firmly on Elias's shoulder. The weight of it was not crushing, but steady, like a hand anchoring him to a truth he could no longer escape. Ayanna's voice carried softly into the stillness. My grandfather says, you came to us as a stranger, you leave as a brother. The words struck Elias with more force than any rifle shot. His throat closed, and he lowered his head, unable to hold the elder's gaze.
He had not come seeking brotherhood or redemption or honor. He had only acted on instinct, on the faint echo of his mother's voice reminding him not to leave another soul to die alone. Yet here he stood, accepted as kin by people who had every reason to hate him. The elder spoke again, his tone filled with solemnity. Ayanna translated, her own voice breaking. He says, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." Elias's heart jolted. He knew the words, John 15:13. His mother had read them by firelight on nights when storm winds shook their cabin walls. He had not heard them in years, not since burying her beneath the dry earth. Yet here, spoken through the lips of an Apache elder, they rang out as clear as a bell. He lifted his eyes. The elder's face was lined with years of hardship, but in his gaze shone an understanding Elias had never found among his own kind. It was as if the old man saw through every failure, every mistake, and still judged him worthy of a place at the fire. The circle of villagers stirred. Men nodded solemnly. Women pressed their hands to their hearts. Even the children looked upon Elias with wide, reverent eyes. The elder's hand remained on his shoulder, heavy with both burden and blessing. Ayanna whispered the final translation. He says, "From this night forward, your fate is bound to ours. In our grief you will mourn. In our joy you will rejoice. In our battles you will stand. You are no longer alone." The fire cracked, sending sparks spiraling into the night. Elias swallowed hard, a single tear cutting through the dust on his cheek. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of loneliness lift, replaced by something steadier, stronger. Family. Not by blood, not by nation, but by sacrifice freely given. And for the first time since losing his kin, Elias Harper felt he had come home. The fire burned lower, its flames settling into a bed of glowing embers. The crowd dispersed into smaller groups, speaking in hushed voices, while warriors still stood watch around the edges of the circle. Elias remained near the gifts, his horse beside him, the elder's handprint still heavy on his shoulder, though the man had already stepped away. Ayanna limped toward him, her step slow but purposeful. She carried no feather, no gift, only the weight of words she had kept hidden until now. The fire burned lower, its flames settling into a bed of glowing embers. The crowd dispersed into smaller groups, speaking in hushed voices, while warriors still stood watch around the edges of the circle. Elias remained near the gifts, his horse beside him, the elder's handprint still heavy on his shoulder, though the man had already stepped away. Ayanna limped toward him, her step slow but purposeful. She carried no feather, no gift, only the weight of words she had kept hidden until now. When she stopped before him, her dark eyes shone not with fear, nor even with gratitude, but with something he could not mistake, pity. "You saved my life," she said softly, her English halting but clear, "and for that I thank you. But—" her gaze lowered, fixed on the dirt between them. "I see sorrow in you deeper than any wound." Elias tried to answer, but his mouth was dry. He had endured questioning from the elders, had stood bound before the fire, had faced the choice of death itself. But these few words pierced him deeper than any trial. Ayanna lifted her eyes again. "Why do you walk as a man already half dead?" The question stripped him bare. He looked away, past her, toward the canyon walls looming like silent judges. The truth pressed against him, demanding release. "I've lost everyone," he whispered. "My parents, my sister, all gone. The land failed me, the ranch turned to dust. I pawned my gun, gave away my horse. I came here with nothing left because there was nothing worth keeping." Ayanna's brow furrowed, her pity deepening. "Yet you still gave. Even when you had nothing, you gave." He shook his head, bitter laughter escaping his lips. No, I wasn't noble.
I wasn't brave. I gave because I couldn't bear to watch someone else slip away like my sister did. It wasn't goodness, it was guilt. The words hung heavy in the air, thicker than the smoke rising from the embers. For a moment, Ayanna said nothing. Then she stepped closer, her voice firm though soft. Maybe guilt brought you to the water, but it was mercy that made you drink. Elias turned to her, searching her eyes for mockery, but found none, only truth spoken with quiet certainty. She touched her hand lightly to his arm, just above the rope burns on his wrist. My people see honor in what you did, but I see something more. I see a man trying to find life again. Elias's throat tightened. He thought of the white feathers at his feet, of the elder's words, of the gifts piled before him. He thought of the verse spoken tonight, words of his own mother's Bible carried on the tongue of an Apache elder. Greater love has no one than this. For the first time in years, Elias did not feel only the weight of loss. He felt the stirrings of something else, something he had long fought buried. Hope. A single drumbeat echoed across the basin, slow and deliberate. The murmurs of the crowd faded, and all eyes turned toward the ridge. The 70 warriors who had come at dawn now mounted their horses once more, their figures tall in the glow of fire and torch. In perfect unison, they urged their steeds forward until they formed a wide circle around Elias. Hooves stamped the earth in rhythm with the drum, sending tremors through the ground beneath his boots. The sight stole his breath. The gray-haired leader raised his feather high, then spoke in careful English. "White brother, we stand with you." One by one, the others lifted their feathers as well. Ayanna, standing near, explained softly, "Each feather is a vow. One feather, one household. Each promises that your life will be guarded as their own." Elias's chest tightened. He looked around at the sea of pale plumes swaying in the torchlight. Each feather was more than a symbol. It was an oath sealed in front of family, tribe, and ancestors. The leader continued, 70 feathers, 70 families. Wherever you walk, food will be set before you. Shelter will be offered. Our blades will rise for your defense. The words struck Elias like a hammer. He had spent years wandering the frontier as a man alone, every stranger a possible enemy, every night uncertain. Now, in one night, he had gained what few men could ever claim, the sworn loyalty of 70 households. He remembered the stories from border towns, treaties written on paper that burned in the first fire of war, promises broken before the ink dried. Yet here no paper was needed. The feathers themselves were treaty enough, each one carried not by governments, but by fathers, mothers, and children who bound their survival to his. Ayanna's eyes glistened as she watched the circle form. This honor is rarer than peace with the cavalry. It is rarer than friendship with the white man's leaders. Only 3 outsiders have ever carried the vow of our feathers. Tonight, you are the 4th. Elias felt his throat close. He looked down at the feathers already laid at his feet, then up at the forest of feathers raised toward the sky. He had given away a horse in despair. Tonight, he was given something beyond price. The circle began to move. The 70 riders advanced, not toward him, but around him, their horses stepping in measured cadence. Slowly, deliberately, they formed an escort. The message was unmistakable. Elias Harper would not leave this place alone. As the drumbeat quickened, the circle pulsed with life. The feathers caught the firelight and shimmered like stars drawn down to earth. For the first time in his life, Elias knew what it meant to belong. And with belonging came a weight heavier than chains, yet lighter than air, the knowledge that 70 families now walked with him, wherever his path would lead. The drumbeat slowed, then stopped.
For a heartbeat, the basin was utterly still. Then a sound rose from the people, soft at first, then swelling into waves. Voices lifted together, weaving a chant that rolled against the canyon walls and climbed into the star-pricked sky. It was not the shrill cry of battle Elias had once feared in his nights along the frontier. This was something older, deeper. The voices rose and fell in harmony, carrying tones that seemed to flow from earth and sky alike. It was a hymn. Though no church walls contained it, no hymn book prescribed its verses. The chant carried both sorrow and triumph. It mourned the price of sacrifice, yet celebrated the courage that gave it meaning. Elias felt the sound wash over him, through him, until his very bones hummed with its cadence. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids another voice rose, not of the Apache, but of Scripture, echoing from his boyhood. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Psalm 23:4. His mother had spoken those words when fever racked his sister's body, when storm winds shook the cabin, when despair hung over their ranch like a storm cloud that wouldn't break. Back then, the verse had seemed a fragile comfort, words spoken into emptiness. Tonight, surrounded by warriors and families who had no reason to claim him, the verse burned with new truth. He had walked into this valley certain of death. Instead, he had found life. Life bound to others, life threaded through sacrifice, life carried in 70 white feathers. The chant swelled. Children lifted their voices. Women wove higher notes above the men's steady rhythm. The sound wrapped the circle like a mantle, drawing Elias into its embrace. He opened his eyes to see the warriors raising their feathers again, the firelight painting each plume in gold.
The elder stepped forward one last time, his voice steady and sure. Ayanna translated, "He says the chant is for you. It carries your name now. It will be remembered as long as these cliffs stand." Elias's breath caught. His name, once just another cowboy drifting on the edge of survival, was now tied to something eternal. The chanting built to a final crescendo, then ceased all at once, as if the night itself had drawn in its breath. Silence followed, heavy yet holy. The stars seemed brighter, the fire sharper, the air clearer. Elias Harper stood taller than he had in years. He was not the man who had stumbled into this canyon, empty-handed and hollow-hearted. He was brother, protector, bearer of feathers and vows. And as the silence held, he whispered the words to himself, words that no longer felt distant but alive. "I will fear no evil, for you are with me." If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. Morning came softly to the basin, spilling gold across the red cliffs and casting long shadows over the Apache dwellings. Smoke rose in thin spirals from cooking fires, carrying the smell of maize and herbs. The night of ceremony was over, but its weight lingered in the air like the echo of a bell that would not fade. Elias woke near the fire circle, wrapped in a blanket someone had placed over his shoulders while he slept. For the first time in months, his rest had been unbroken. No dreams of fevered faces, no gnawing hunger, no hollow ache of failure. Only silence, warm and steady, as if the earth itself had held him. He rose slowly, his body stiff, but his spirit strangely light. His horse waited nearby, feathers and beadwork still tied in its mane, its dark eyes watching him with calm familiarity. He reached out and stroked its neck, the gesture both intimate and new. The animal no longer felt like just his. It carried the weight of 70 households, their trust bound into its reins. Around him the village stirred. Children chased one another through the dust, their laughter ringing clear. Women ground maize or tended fires, pausing to glance his way with expressions that held neither suspicion nor fear, but recognition. Men stood in clusters, sharpening knives, preparing saddles, their voices low but steady.
Wherever Elias looked, he found eyes meeting his with a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement, "You are one of us now." Ayanna approached, leaning still on her walking stick, but moving with more strength than the day before. The fever had broken, and though pain marked her limp, there was determination in her step. "You will ride today?" she asked gently. Elias nodded, his gaze drifting toward the canyon's edge, where the trail climbed back into the open desert. "I think so. There's grazing land north of here, better water than what I left behind." Ayanna studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "My grandfather says you leave with more than you came, not just the horse, not just the gifts. You leave with 70 voices that will rise if your name is spoken. That bond will not break." Elias's throat tightened. He searched for words and found only truth. "I never asked for any of this." "No," Ayanna agreed softly. "But sometimes it is not we who choose the path. Sometimes the path chooses us." Her words settled into him like water sinking into dry ground. He thought of the canyon where he had first heard her faint cries, of the impulse that had driven him to give up his horse. Foolish, he had called it then, madness. Yet here he stood, alive because of it, renewed because of it. He glanced at Ayanna. "What will they remember of me?" Ayanna smiled faintly, though sorrow flickered in her eyes. "They will remember a man who gave when he had nothing left to give. That is enough." Elias let the words sink deep. He looked again toward the trail, the open horizon beyond. For so long the horizon had mocked him, a line always out of reach. Today it felt different, not a reminder of what he lacked, but an invitation. The elder appeared then, walking with slow steps but steady bearing. His feathered mantle trailed the dust, his eyes as sharp as the first time Elias had seen him. He placed both hands on Elias's shoulders, speaking in tones that Ayanna translated. "He says the covenant stands. Where you walk, our people will see. Where you rest, our people will remember. You carry not only our promise, but our watching. Do not forget." Elias bowed his head. "I won't." The elder's hands fell away, but his gaze lingered, heavy with both blessing and warning. Then he turned and walked back toward the dwellings, leaving Elias with Ayanna and the open path. The sun climbed higher, touching the rim of the canyon in brilliance. Elias tightened the reins of his horse, feeling the weight of the feathers and beadwork brush against his fingers. He swung into the saddle, every movement deliberate, every breath carrying the weight of choice. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a man running from his past. He felt like a man riding into a future that waited for him. The village gathered once more as Elias prepared to leave. Children perched on the low walls of the dwellings, their small hands waving feathers in farewell. Women stood with baskets of food, pressing them into the arms of riders who would accompany him. Men adjusted saddles and checked weapons, their movements efficient, their eyes steady. At the center of it all, Elias mounted his horse. The reins felt different in his hands, not only because of the beadwork and feathers, but because they no longer tethered him to solitude. They tethered him to 70 families, to a covenant sealed by fire, feather, and vow. The gray-haired warrior who had first confronted him gave a sharp command. In perfect rhythm, the 70 warriors swung into their saddles. The sight struck Elias with awe. 70 horses stamping the earth, 70 feathers swaying like pale flames in the morning light. They moved not as individuals but as one body, an honor guard drawn from the heartbeat of a people. Ayanna stepped forward, her limp slowing her pace but not her resolve. She reached for his stirrup, her hand light against the leather. "Where will you go, brother?" Ayanna looked down at her. For a moment, he thought of the cabin that lay empty miles behind him, the graves he had left untended, the land that had failed him. He thought, too, of the gifts piled at his feet, of the chance that had carried his name into the night sky. He looked toward the north, where mountains rose blue and distant against the horizon.
"I'll ride toward the high country," he said. "I hear there's good grazing there. And perhaps—" His voice faltered, then steadied. "Perhaps I'll find new neighbors worth knowing." Ayana's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Then go with honor. Our voices ride with you." The elder raised his hand, and the warriors closed ranks around Elias. Together they turned toward the canyon's edge, the trail winding upward into the open land. As they rode, the village voices rose in song. Not the solemn chant of the night before, but a lighter melody, carried by children's laughter and women's strong tones. It was a song of blessing, of farewell, of hope. The sound followed them, echoing against the canyon walls, until it blended with the cry of hawks wheeling above. At the crest of the trail, Elias reined in his horse and looked back. The basin lay below, the dwelling small against the vast red earth, smoke rising gently into the clear morning. For the first time, the sight did not fill him with fear or strangeness. It filled him with belonging. He turned again toward the horizon. The 70 warriors flanked him, their presence like a living wall, their feathers gleaming against the rising sun. The land stretched wide before them, harsh, untamed, but no longer empty. Elias's hand brushed the feathers tied to his saddle, their whiteness bright against the worn leather. He thought of his mother's Bible, of verses long forgotten but now alive in him. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." The words came not as fragile hope, but as certainty. He had walked through shadow, he had faced death, and he had found life, life shared, life bound, life given by grace he had not deserved. The gray-haired warrior urged his horse forward, and the others followed. Elias fell into rhythm among them, his own mount strong beneath him. The escort did not surround him as a prisoner, nor as a guest. They rode with him as kin. The horizon opened, wide and unbroken. For the first time in years, Elias Harper did not see it as exile. He saw it as promise. And with 70 feathers at his side, he rode toward it, a man remade. As the dust settles on Elias Harper's journey, perhaps you feel a tug at your own memories, of choices made when no one was watching, of kindness offered when it seemed foolish, of moments when faith carried you through the valley of shadows. The story of one cowboy and 70 white feathers is more than legend. It's a mirror of our own lives. We all long for belonging, for redemption, for a place where sacrifice is not forgotten. If this tale stirred your heart, know that there are many more true Wild West stories waiting. Stories of courage, faith, and the unbreakable bonds of humanity on the frontier. Subscribe to our channel, share this video with someone who cherishes the old ways, and join us as we preserve and tell the stories that remind us who we are and who we can still become.